Alrighty, let me just get everything situated here. Hope you guys are doing good, all two of you. Oh man, not feeling the best today, but not feeling bad enough that I wouldn't stream. Um, all right, so what are we doing today? I was actually going to do I had something different planned for this stream. I knew I was going to stream this week, and I had something different planned last week. Um, Over in the Twitter sphere, I had an argument that I propagated and put forward. I knew it would gain a little bit of traction, and it did. It went like semi-viral for Twitter's sake, at least like in the apologetic sphere. And I had a bunch of a bunch of Christian apologists give their 2 cents, and so at some point I want to cover it because I do think it's a good argument. Um, in fact, I think it's a very persuasive argument. And so I had various, like I said, Christian apologists weigh in, and I want to kind of dissect their responses because I really didn't hear too many responses that were very good. And again, I think it's a persuasive argument. But anyways, I'll do that. That was my original plan for this stream, and I'll do that at some point, maybe even later on in the week. Um, but the reason for this stream with regards to Eli Ayala, I'll go over that in just a little bit. That the reason that took precedence is because even though Eli Ayala is not responding to me specifically, as we'll see, he is responding to arguments or questions that were prompted from things that I've said. So we'll get to that in a little bit, and then that's what we're going to get to in the stream, and then I have an interesting video in the works. It's barely in the. I was actually working on a separate video, so I write out all my videos, all my scripts, and I had a different script that I was writing, and then something came across my desk, and so I have a pretty interesting video that I'm working on. I don't want to say too much yet, but I think it'll ruffle some feathers. And I'll leave it there. So anyways, and that one's still in the infancy stage. I'm still writing. In fact, I'm not even writing the script yet. I'm doing research and taking notes on certain things. Anyways, so what we're going to look at today is we're going to be looking at an interview with Eli Ayala. And the reason we're going to be looking at that interview, and in fact, let me pull it up so you guys can see. All right, so we're going to be looking at this individual's channel, Kelvin's Faith Unfiltered. It's easy to read that and think it's Kevin. I thought it was Kevin at first. So Kelvin's Faith Unfiltered. This is a relatively new YouTube channel, I believe. And so this individual, I believe this is the one. This is the gentleman who messaged me. He commented on I believe he commented on my video on Jay Dyer, and I believe he's Kelvin. I've only watched this one interview, so I believe this is him. But he messaged me about my video on Jay Dyer and Tag, and he was very honest. And said that he thought I made some good points, which I think is interesting because it's difficult for, I think, presups, at least the ones I've encountered, to ever entertain the idea that a possibly good objection has been brought forward against Tag. So anyways, so he commented and basically said that one of the reasons they set up this interview was to ask a presup like Eli Ayala some of the questions that came from them watching my video. And so you can even see down here in the comment, they said, I will say that some of my questions were inspired by the video Skeptical Agnostic did on Jay Dyer. As a presup and a proponent of Tag, I wanted someone I knew to answer some of the questions brought up. I will be curious if Eli answered some of the questions or concerns Skeptical Agnostic brought up. So, I think that that's very honest of them. I haven't heard too many presups admit that anything that I've brought forward against Tag is formidable. So anyways, they seem like really nice dudes. Again, I believe I've only gone back and forth in the comments with Kelvin. I think this other individual's name is Josiah or they're going to say it in the beginning right now. So I apologize if that's not his name. But anyway, so I thought that this was really interesting because they're bringing forward questions or things that I brought up in my video on Jay Dyer, and Eli Ayala was responding. And so they asked me to watch the interview. And I went ahead and watched the interview and still voiced my concern. So here's the interesting thing. I watched the interview, everything, all the concerns that I have. I think Eli Ayala falls into the same pitfalls as Jay Dyer, although Eli Ayala should not be compared to Jay Dyer because Eli Ayala is a nice guy. But I think he falls into the same pitfalls, the same. Thanks a lot, Kyle. So yeah, I think, again, I just, anybody pushing precept, I don't see how they won't fall into these pitfalls, especially when it comes to tag and the impossibility of the contrary. So yeah, that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at this interview with Eli Ayala. They're going to ask him questions based on my video, and they don't really mention me or my video on Jay Dyer explicitly, but that is where their questions are coming from. And again, after I watched this video or watched this interview, I chatted with Kelvin and told him, how I didn't think Eli evaded any of the issues. And he said that they're having a subsequent interview with him. Actually, I think it took place yesterday. So I'll be interested to see them post that, because I think they said they were going to push or they were going to prod Eli a little bit more on the impossibility of the contrary, because they felt like, or I don't know if they felt like, but I told him I felt like he really didn't answer a lot of these questions directly. Some of them he did, but some of the others he didn't. So all right. So let's get to it really quick. If you don't know anything about Eli Ayala, he's a really nice dude. I've subscribed to his channel a while back, and he's everything a presuppositionalist should be. He's really good faith. He's really respectful. I would love to have a dialogue with him at some point, because he's a good faith interlocutor. He's not like a Phil bro or an ortho bro. He's not an asshole like Jay Dyer or Jim Bob or Andrew Wilson, any of those in that ilk. And what's interesting too is I'm now going to throw Father Deacon Ananias in that group, because I used to think Father Deacon Ananias was like, he's the one who stood out. Like, he was the respectful one, and he can be, but just like Jay Dyer and Jim Bob, he can just be disrespectful and an asshole. So anyway, so my point is Eli Ayala is not like that. He's very respectful. And so yeah, it's a breath of fresh air to get a presupper who's not super antagonistic. And these gentlemen aren't either. The Kelvin and his co-host here are really nice guys, and I've had good back and forths with them. All right, so let's get into the video. I'm going to play a little bit from the introduction, and then we're going to kind of jump because Eli at some point starts talking about different types of syllogisms and validity, and we don't really need to cover that. So I'm going to start playing the video. If you guys can just put in the chat when I play the video, if you can hear it. But really quick, FDA is the overlap of the Thomist and precept circles on the Venn diagram. I actually don't know too much about FDA's metaphysics. You're probably right. I've read his paper, and I hope you guys watched Alex Malpass's video on Father Deacon Ananias's paper. I thought Malpass shredded it to pieces. In fact, I had read the paper before, and Malpass brought up a bunch of things that I hadn't even considered. But then somebody brought that paper to Father Deacon Ananias's attention, and he basically just called Alex a faggot and was like, I'm not going to deal with this. So I was really like, that's all he did. And so I was really disappointed. I thought he was more of a stand-up gentleman than that, but I guess not. So, all right, let's jump into this and we'll get going here.
All right, tonight we're putting the transcendental argument for God to the test, and we're doing it with someone who has become one of the leading voices on this topic. If you don't know his YouTube channel, you will after tonight. It is called Revealed Apologetics. And today we have with us Mr. Eli Ayala. Thank you so much for being with us here tonight. How are you doing, brother?
I'm doing great. Have had a very busy summer, but it has been all good. And it's coming to
Thanks, AJ, for, I don't know if that's your name, AJ. but it says AJ's. Oh, thank you for letting me know about the volume.
Will close for me, starting up work again next week. So things will be going back into kind of the yearly duties and driving to work and all the rest, but everything's going very well.
Awesome. Well, we're so thankful for your time. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Josiah Spencer. Josiah, it's good to have you back. How are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing well.
All
Glad
right.
to be
Well,
here.
I am not going to lollygag as usual. I think it's time we get into it because, like I said, we want to put Tag to the test tonight. And I can't think of a better person to have to do that than Eli. So I want to start off with what may be a simple question, although most recent things that I've come across, some people have had a hard time actually doing this. And I've seen you do this online. So I'm going to ask you, can you please put the transcendental argument, right? The basic focal point of presuppositional apologetics into some form of a syllogism so that we know what that is. And maybe if you could even explain what a syllogism is and why we use it inside of philosophy or apologetics.
Yeah. Well, first, the syllogism is...
So I don't want to spend time talking about what a syllogism is. I mean, if you guys have any questions in the comments about what a syllogism is, I mean, I don't mind going over it, or we can let Eli go over it. But so he talks a little bit about syllogisms and the difference between abductive, inductive, and deductive arguments. Yeah, I agree, AJ, about Eli. So yeah, we don't need to go over that. Let's just jump into where he actually formulates the argument. And again, Kelvin talks about, a lot of presuppers don't usually put Tag into a syllogism. And this is something that I've noticed all the way back to Van Til and Greg Bahnsen. They never really put the argument into a syllogism. And Eli kind of talks about why he, I guess, doesn't always go for the syllogism because he thinks that even once you formulate the syllogism, premise one turns into an indirect proof, which is correct. But yeah, again, this is in reference to my video, I think, on Jay Dyer, where I castigated Jay for, if you haven't watched that video on Jay Dyer, I mean, I would highly recommend it. It's the video, I mean, I have a couple videos on Jay Dyer, but it's the first one I made about Tag, and where Jay, for many years, had trouble putting Tag into a syllogism. I mean, for many, many years. And sometimes he would try and he would formulate an invalid syllogism, or he would just kind of ramble on and you were never able to kind of discern an actual syllogism. And then recently, in the last few years, he's been able to finally articulate it as a syllogism. But I think that that's what they're referencing. So, all right, let's jump to, and he talks about syllogisms for like 3 minutes. So, which is not a bad thing. All right, so here's where I believe he actually starts to formulate. So his formulation of Tag is similar to Jay's, but it's a little bit different. But it still gets across really the same idea.
For your audience, but the transcendental argument for the existence of God has typically not been put into a syllogism because it is typically understood as what's called a indirect argument. It doesn't follow the traditional lines of like deductive linear argumentation. Now, it can be put in that form, but even when you do that, even when you put it in a deductive argument, you're defending the key premise in an indirect way. So the transcendental argument never moves away from indirect proof as opposed to direct proof in logical argumentation. Now, I put
okay, so actually he hasn't formulated it yet. Really quick, an honest doubter says, I asked Jay on well, let me just highlight his comment. He said, I asked Jay on MDD. What's an MDD? Maybe I'm an idiot. About the impossibility of the contrary. He claimed you can just compartmentalize all traditions easily. Yeah, I mean, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. And again, if you, Dr. Alex Malpass also did, I think he did a live stream on Jay Dyer recently, and he talked about, modern day debates. Thank you. Yeah, I know about that. Thanks. Yeah, he did a live stream on this issue specifically about Jay claiming he can just compartmentalize all the opposing worldviews. Actually, and I said this when I had my, it wasn't a debate, but my discussion with Darwin to Jesus, that live stream, I talked about how this is a problem. Like, even if you say, because Jay says, there's only like 7 starting points. And I think Eli says roughly the same, kind of the same thing as we're going to see later. And that doesn't work. Just saying that there's 7 starting points. So what, you only have to refute 7 different possible like potential worldviews is not, that doesn't work, because you get into these multiple different iterations and whatnot. But we'll talk about that in just a bit. So yeah, that just doesn't work. Okay, so sorry, he was talking about that tag is predicated on an indirect proof. And what he's talking about there is an indirect proof is usually like a reductio. Like when you do a reductio, you don't necessarily put out like a syllogism and derive a conclusion with the reductio, right? You if you're trying to prove a proposition P, you assume not P, and then you just show that not P leads to a contradiction. And I guess you can do that through a syllogism, but it's just, anyways, that's an indirect way to prove P, right? You assume not P, and then you derive a contradiction from it. So that's what he's talking about. I guess that's why he's saying that's why he normally doesn't formulate tag as a syllogism, because even if you formulate it as a syllogism, and as you'll see in just a little bit, like his premise 1 is going to be the key premise, and his point is, in order to prove premise 1, I would need to do an indirect proof. So that's why he doesn't like putting it in a syllogism. But he says I can, and he does, so I appreciate that. So let's keep going.
Tag, this is the syllogism that I used in my debate with Dan Barker. Premise 1, if knowledge is possible, then the Christian worldview is true. Knowledge is possible, therefore the Christian worldview is true. Now, I use knowledge, but you can substitute knowledge with anything that your opponent accepts. You can say intelligibility exists. Okay, if things are intelligible, then the Christian worldview is true. Things are in fact intelligible, therefore the Christian worldview is true. All you're doing there is you're laying out the transcendental claim in that first premise, and the way you defend that premise will be through the indirect demonstration of the transcendental argument. So basically, premise 1 is saying that the Christian worldview, the entire system of Christian thought, is what must be the case in order for anything to be intelligible, for knowledge to be possible, these sorts of things.
All right, so so he did formulate his syllogism. Let me try to find it. There we go. Oh, there's premise 1. Okay, so premise 1, if knowledge is possible, then the Christian worldview is true. Premise 2, knowledge is possible. Conclusion, the Christian worldview is true. So that's obviously a valid syllogism. And the question is whether or not it's sound. And the key premise, just like with all of them, like even with J's, like X is the necessary precondition of Y, it's usually the first premise that's going to be contended with. I don't know how many people are going to contend with premise 2. So premise 1, if knowledge is possible, then the Christian worldview is true. An equivalent proposition to that, right? Like the contrapositive of that, that's a hypothetical, if P then Q. So a equivalent statement would be if not Q, then not P. So the equivalent statement would be if the Christian worldview is false, then knowledge is impossible. So it's making it quite clear that only Christianity can account for knowledge. So that premise 1, he calls it like the transcendental premise, but that's the impossibility of the contrary. And it might not seem like it, right? It just says if knowledge is possible, then the Christian worldview is true. But once you formulate it with the contrapositive of if the Christian worldview is false, then knowledge is impossible, hopefully it's clear then that that's the impossibility of the contrary. So premise 1 is the impossibility of the contrary, and that's what the tag proponent, that's what somebody like Eli Ayala or the Presup needs to refute. An honest doubter said, not to mention you have to refute every public and private worldview too, not just the big ones. Yeah, and I mean, what do you even characterize as the big ones? I guess like materialism and naturalism and nominalism and all that type of stuff. But even then, like there's going to be so many different splinterings. Again, Alex Malpass demonstrated this. I would highly recommend you watch his video, his recent video on Jay Dyer, because he demonstrates it beautifully. That again, just take just take different views about morality and epistemology and ontology, and just put like those three categories together, and you're going to get thousands of different worldviews. You're going to get thousands of them, right? And so, yeah, this whole, like, again, we're going to talk about this in just a little bit, because in fact, I have two videos, because in this video, I feel like Eli does not address the issue of the quote unquote non-Christian worldview. But there is an interview he did with Jason Lyle, who's also a presuppositionalist, that I want to highlight later as well, because they talk about it more in depth, whereas I feel like Eli didn't really address it well in this interview. Let me see. And then Absolute Optimist, I just saw that you had you had commented on one of my videos. So he said, I literally just uploaded a video showing trivialism is impossible to refute by only internal critiques. Yeah, it's funny, trivialism always pops up in these streams, but I think for good reason. And actually, we can talk about it later, because it is trivialism is going to be something related to what Eli says a little bit later on. And then Absolute. So I'll have to check out your channel. I didn't even know you had a channel, Absolute Optimist. So I'll definitely check it out. And then he says, not only get thousands of worldviews, but trivialism is pretty much irrefutable with their gold standard method of internal critique. Yeah, the point is, I don't know how you could possibly refute something like trivialism, or even something like dialetheism, by pointing to a contradiction, right? By doing a reductio. It's not going to work. And I've talked about that in past streams. I did a past stream on Jay Dyer and we talked about it. But yeah, that's going to be an issue too. And we'll talk about that as Eli progresses in this interview. But let's keep going. So we stopped at around 6:07. All right, let's keep going.
A lot of skeptics make the mistake by saying, well, that's a nice.
So I'm sorry, I just want to highlight again. So let's just keep in mind, premise one is the impossibility of the contrary. That's the premise that I would put the burden on Eli, like, okay, let's see you demonstrate the impossibility of the contrary. And he's up to the challenge. He's not going to shy away from it. So let's keep going.
Possible, these sorts of things. Now, a lot of skeptics make the mistake by saying, well, that's a nice claim, Mr. Christian. No, it's not merely a claim. It's part of the argument that needs to be demonstrated. So we seek to demonstrate that first premise by employing a two-sided coin approach to defending the Christian worldview, both with a positive presentation as to how the Christian worldview provides the necessary preconditions. So we talk about what is it about the Christian worldview that actually does the work for supplying the preconditions. And then to make an illustrative point, we show that the contrary worldview, whomever we're talking with, maybe it's the atheist or the Muslim, that given the hypothetical truth of their position, they don't provide the necessary preconditions for knowledge and intelligence.
I just want to rewind that and play it again, because it's really important what he just said. Because what he just said demonstrates, as we'll see in a little bit, that he's not going to be able to prove the impossibility of the contrary with what he's saying.
For supplying the preconditions. And then to make an illustrative point, we show that the contrary worldview, whomever we're talking with, maybe it's the atheist or the Muslim.
The contrary worldview, whoever we're talking with, okay?
That given the hypothetical truth of their position, they don't provide the necessary preconditions for knowledge and intelligible experience and things like this. Now,
let me jump in.
Okay, so yeah, that's big right there. Sorry, I forgot to take this comment down. Yeah, that's huge. So he's basically, so his method is basically identical to Jay Dyer's, right? Jay Dyer says, well, first, I wish I could do a Jay Dyer impression. Well, first we do they demonstrate how Christianity, how the Christian worldview, and what we're going to see is another big issue is there is no the Christian worldview, right? I mean, Jay Dyer has a different Christian worldview than Eli Ayala, but nevertheless, right, Jay Dyer will say, well, first we demonstrate how the Christian worldview can account for the preconditions of intelligibility, and then we refute our interlocutor's position and have them, try to account for the preconditions of intelligibility. And Eli's is very similar, right? He's saying, well, we demonstrate how Christianity can account for knowledge or intelligibility or whatnot, and then we refute, the worldview, the person that we're talking to at that moment. So that's not going to get you to the impossibility of the contrary. At best, that'll get you to your worldview works and the person you're talking to, their worldview doesn't. That doesn't demonstrate that your worldview and only your worldview can possibly account for knowledge or the preconditions of intelligibility, whatnot. That doesn't work. So I'm really surprised that Eli would say that. And again, we're going to look at another interview Eli did, because he actually brings up this issue to Jason Lyle. So I'm surprised that he's, like propagating his method this way. It just won't work. And there is also, if you have the Christian worldview and then you have the contrary worldview, there is no single contrary worldview, right? And again, that's something that we're going to bring up. So the point here is just that the impossibility of the contrary will not work with this method. At best, all you'll do is demonstrate, at best, right? This is assuming that they can demonstrate that their worldview can account for the preconditions of intelligibility, which even then, I think there's major issues there. And then number two, supposedly refuting their interlocutor's worldview will not work. Here's the other thing too, and I mentioned this in my video on Jay Dyer, and this is really important. If tag is valid and if tag is sound, I admit tag is valid, but whether or not it's sound should not depend on who the presuppositional apologist is talking to at that moment, right? So let's say I was talking to Eli right now. Whether or not he has the ability to refute my worldview is irrelevant. He should be able to, and any precept apologist should be able to propagate tag on its own, and it should stand completely on its own. It shouldn't be dependent upon who the person is talking to at that moment. And again, I articulated this in my video on Jay. I gave an analogy, like suppose you were walking along and you picked up a book and the book contained mathematical proofs, and you wanted to know whether or not those mathematical proofs were valid and sound. It would have nothing to do with whether, there doesn't need to be an interlocutor, right? Either the argument on its own is valid and sound or it's not. So for Eli to say, well, and then we refute the worldview of the person we're talking to, say you're not talking to anybody, right? Say you're just giving a lecture on tag and you have to demonstrate the impossibility of the contrary. How are you going to do that, right? There's nobody in front of you. There's no interlocutor. There's no atheist. There's no materialist for you to try to refute. So how are you going to prove tag? How are you going to prove the impossibility of the contrary? And I think that's a huge point, that's a major point for why this doesn't work. Let me look at some of the comments here. Let me see. I don't know if some of you are talking to each other or talking to me. Oh yeah, you're going back and forth. Okay. So AJ says, also worth noting that Dyer's all paradigms have a finite set of starting points assumes his paradigm for what constitutes a worldview. Yeah, and this is also another issue where different apologists give different definitions of worldview. Actually, when I had my discussion with Darwin to Jesus, we kind of got into this where Eli has a different definition than Greg Bonson of what a worldview is. And so, yeah, you run into this issue as well, where a worldview is not clearly defined in presuppositionalist circles. In most instances, they mean roughly the same thing. But in a lot of instances, or in some instances, they don't. And so it's also going to depend on what you mean by worldview. So, yeah, so I think this is... so Absolute Optimist says, in analytic philosophy and mathematics, impossibility proofs are extremely hard. Yeah, I mean, I went to school for math, and those things were very difficult. Yeah, it's not easy to do that. And it's even more difficult when you don't have a clear proposition. So, right, if you're going to say, well, we have the Christian worldview and then the non-Christian worldview, I don't know what that means, the non-Christian worldview. I don't think that there's any clear categorization of what that is. So I don't know how you can possibly refute the non-Christian worldview, right? Because think about it. In the non-Christian worldview, you have Islam and you have Mormons, if you consider that, Mormons are not Christians. And then you have materialists, and then you have atheist Platonists, and then you have trivialists, and then you have constructivists and intuitionists. And I mean, you have all these different groups in the non-Christian worldview. How can you possibly think that in one fell swoop, you can just refute that? I don't I don't know that that's possible. I think the impossibility to the contrary is impossible. So anyway, so yeah, deists as well. Yeah. So I just don't see how this works. And I don't see how Eli, talking about refuting, his interlocutor's position does anything. It really doesn't do anything to bolster the impossibility of the contrary. Okay, let's get back to the video. Thank you guys for your comments. Let's see. Sorry, Double Donkey Surfer. I don't know how you surf double donkeys, but you let me know. He says, is presup or tag valid, or is it affirming the consequent? I know they say their worldview is the only possibility. So somebody commented this on my channel recently, and they said tag isn't even valid, it's affirming the consequent. And I just pointed, and I thought that this guy was a non-believer. And so I told him, like, it doesn't affirm the consequent, like it's valid. And at least like the way that Eli formulated it, it's just he formulated it as modus ponens. If P then Q, P therefore Q. So that's not affirming the consequent. And I think some people think that J's formulation is affirming the consequent because it says X is the necessary precondition of Y therefore X, because he's but it's, in order to affirm the consequent, it has to be put into a hypothetical if P then Q. So you have to reformulate J's first premise as an if P then Q. And once you reformulate J's premise, his premise one, as an if P then Q, it's not affirming the consequent. So hopefully that answers your question. But anyway, some guy on my channel commented that, and I told him, like, no, it's valid, and he like blew up in my face. But then I think he was a believer, so it was just really weird. If an argument's valid, let's admit that it's valid. But yeah, so I don't think that tag commits affirming the consequent. But thanks for that comment. AJ said, I've seen some formulations that ended up affirming the consequent when you include their defense for premise one. I mean, yeah, I guess it could be the case that if they're trying to provide like another syllogism or other premises to bolster premise one, they might affirm the consequent. I'd have to see a specific example, but I had seen that articulated specifically with regards to J's argument, and I don't believe J's argument affirms the consequent. But so Double Donkey Surfer says, I'm just going to call you DDS. DDS says it's one of Planet Peterson's claims when he did his J. Dyer video. Okay, I'll have to check that out. I've watched some Planet Peterson, but I know Peterson's forte is not philosophy. I could be wrong about that, but I think his forte is more like science. So maybe he got that wrong, but I could be wrong. So I'll have to check it out. And then Z Parks 2727 says, is it ever worth debating taggers, or should they be left alone? Well, I think people like Eli, he's a really honest interlocutor. I really like his stuff. He's a really nice guy. These individuals too, the ones who are interviewing him, Kelvin and Josiah, are really nice dudes. I think if you can find honest faith interlocutors, absolutely go ahead and have a discussion with them. Again, I would love to have a discussion with Eli. I actually hope he sees this video, and I would love to have a discussion with him because he's a really nice dude. But people like Jay Dyer and whatnot. So like, here's the thing. I still get debate Jay Dyer comments on my YouTube videos. And I'm like, I will absolutely. I know when I did my interview with Alex Malpass, he was like, I don't think you should bother. He was like, I wouldn't debate Jay Dyer, but I would, because I think Jay Dyer needs to be put in his place. And people say, then call into his show. Like, fuck that. I'm not going to call into his show, because then he controls the dialogue and then he'll just talk over you. If I did a debate with Jay, it would be on something like MDD, on modern day debates, where we have a moderator and where he can't just like bulldoze his way through the discussion. So yeah, and in that case, if I had a debate with Jay, I can't say that I would be going in good faith. Like, I wouldn't be going into the debate just to have an honest dialogue with Jay. I would probably be going into that debate because I wanted to win. Because I think Jay needs to be, it needs to be shown that Jay's worldview is a losing worldview. And same with Jim Bob. I've been on Jim Bob to have a debate with me because he's done a couple streams on my stuff, and I did a video on him. And what I've noticed is Jim Bob really likes to do debates about evolution, and he like puts the onus on the person who's promulgating evolution. And but I rarely see him do debates about whether or not Christianity is true, or like debates on epistemology regarding Christianity. I would love to have a debate with him regarding that, but he seems to be not interested in that. So all right, if you can find some of the knowledgeable preceptors out there, debating with them can sharpen your own philosophical aptitude. Yeah, and I love talking with precepts also, because it does sharpen your epistemology, I think. Okay, and then Craig. Hey, how's it going, Craig? Craig says, do you think tag is de facto fallacious or valid but untrue? I think it's valid but untrue. And again, I don't even know how you would go about demonstrating like Eli's premise 1. I don't know how you would go about demonstrating that. It seems almost impossible to me. But yeah, I think it's valid but untrue. All right, let's jump back into the video. Thank you guys for the comments. I appreciate it. I'm glad more of you showed up. When we started, there were like 2 people, and I was like, oh shit, well, what the hell? But I'm glad you guys showed up. Okay, so where were we? Okay, so sorry, I have my notes here. Okay, so we were just talking about how his premise 1 is the impossibility of the contrary, and his method for demonstrating premise 1 will not prove the impossibility of the contrary. It will not demonstrate that. So let's keep going here. This next section might be a little bit long, and maybe I'll pause it and jump in, but let's keep going.
Stop me at any moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
No,
Because I wanted to make one more point, but because I know you're going to have a bunch of questions after that. But
well, I think I just want to touch on something. So I think it's part 1 is how do you demonstrate this? Because you were talking about the positive. One of the complaints, as we've tried to, or now we've entered in this arena of the social media world, and we're hearing the pushback. That's one of the pushbacks that we hear, is that a lot of presuppositionalists don't give the positive. It's normally this defensive thing or an attack on others, which, so basically this worldview doesn't work. This view doesn't work. Worldview doesn't work. So, but that doesn't prove that your worldview, meaning the tag or presupposition. So kind of give us some, if you could, some of that, so that we understand what the actual positive approach to it is, or the positive defense of it is, and kind of put that to bed for us, or at least help us.
Sure.
Navigate.
Yeah. Well, that's a good question, because a lot of people will use presuppositional apologetics and transcendental argumentation as kind of just attacking the other side. What's odd is that when the skeptic or the critic says, well, that's all presuppositional apologetics is, and that's all what the transcendental argument is, and that's so dumb. You don't prove your view is true by showing someone else's view is wrong. Yes, that's right. And it's at this point we need to make a distinction between presuppositionalism as a methodology and presuppositionalists, which refers to individuals who might use the methodology in a particular way. Online presuppositionalists are infamous for being obnoxious, bullying, and just attacking another person's perspective, and just needling them without giving anything further by way.
So this is why I appreciate Eli, because he's honest about this, and he's the type of person who, he's not the type of person he's describing, right? He's very good faith, and treats his dialogues in good faith, and he's describing people like Jay Dyer and Jim Bob, right? Who they're just not good faith interlocutors. So it was nice to hear him say that. I'm going to kind of skip ahead, because now he's just going to talk about that a little bit, about how it's not just about attacking your opponent. It's about demonstrating the positive case for Christianity. But again, I still don't think that works for the impossibility of the contrary. That might work for like an abductive argument, where it's the inference of the best explanation, if you want, but that's not going to get you to tag. It's not going to get you to the impossibility of the contrary. Okay, so let's jump ahead to 10. And for those of you that came maybe a little bit later, how dare you? No, I'm just kidding. But in case you're wondering what we're doing here, these individuals, Kelvin and Josiah, they saw my video on Jay Dyer. I appreciate their honesty. They thought that I brought up some good points, and so they wanted to interview Eli and see if he could answer some of the things that I brought up. Now, again, they don't mention me explicitly. They do in the comments here. They talk about how some of their questions were inspired by my video. So again, I appreciate that. And I appreciate their honesty. And so they came to me and asked me to watch this interview. And again, while I like Eli, I think he falls into the same pitfalls that Jay Dyer does. He's just a lot nicer than Jay Dyer. So let's jump over here. All right.
Differentiate those and proceed accordingly. Now, that out of the way, take the syllogism here. And I laid this out in my opening statement with Dan Barker because I anticipated someone would bring this up. So my argument is, if knowledge is possible, the Christian worldview is true. Knowledge is possible, therefore the Christian worldview is true. How do you defend the first premise? Well, first, we can begin to unpack what are the preconditions for knowledge. What must be true in order for knowledge to be the case? And this is asking, what are those transcendental categories that provide the preconditions for the very possibility of knowledge? That's what I picked there. Knowledge, you can pick any other thing you'd like. And a few of them, just to name a few, in order for knowledge to be possible, truth must exist. If there's no truth, then you can't have a justified true belief, which is the definition of knowledge. Now, those who might be more philosophically sophisticated, they might highlight, well, justified true belief is how some people define knowledge, but you have issues of warrant and, the writings of Alvin Plantinga and debates over how to define knowledge. And if someone wants to be a philosophical stickler about those terms, then you can take back your argument and then rephrase it. If intelligibility is possible, the Christian worldview is true. Intelligibility is possible, therefore the Christian worldview is true. Intelligibility is presupposed regardless of what definition of knowledge you're going to give.
So this is important because, the way he formulated the syllogism, he says he's talking about knowledge. But again, not everyone's going to agree with the definition of justified true belief. And actually, justified true belief on its own won't work, as we know from Gettier cases. But you can tweak it a little bit. But what if you're an externalist about knowledge, right? So Eli says, well, then we can just pivot to intelligibility. Like, okay, but this is the point, right? Like, this is the issue with the impossibility of the contrary. Like, if you're going to do an internal critique, right, you got to put on the hat that the other person is wearing, or you got to put on the hat of the other worldview. And there's so many different hats. That's the point, right? Like, there is no non-Christian worldview, because in that non-Christian worldview, you're going to have people who disagree about knowledge. You're going to have people who disagree about intelligibility. In fact, we're going to see in a little bit, there's issues that crop up like realism and nominalism, and you have Christians that are nominalists, right? And so the point is, there's so many different facets to so many different worldviews that I just don't see how you can, in one fell swoop, demonstrate the impossibility of the contrary. I did want to, AJ said, 19 watching, only 2 likes. Click on that like. I really appreciate that, AJ. Thank you. I do appreciate that. Trying to grow this channel, and that kind of stuff helps. So I appreciate it. And then Juan's here, my man Juan, Modern Atheism. Good to see you, man. Thanks for joining. I always appreciate it that you show up to my streams. And then AJ says, intelligibility is typically too vague to be useful in an argument. Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. Like, intelligibility, you might say it's pretty straightforward, but not exactly. And especially, you're going to have precepts who disagree about exactly what's entailed in intelligibility, right? What grounds intelligibility? What are the different facets of intelligibility? So yeah, I mean, I appreciate that. Let's keep going. Where are we? Okay. All right, let's keep going. So really quick, he's going to start talking about the laws of logic, because he's going to argue that the laws of logic have something to do with intelligibility. And here again, I think this is where we're going to kind of demonstrate that the task for the precept is just too high, because he's going to start talking about laws of logic in his own worldview, right? I guess seemingly forgetting that when you're talking about the non-Christian worldview, assuming that that's a thing, you're going to have a lot of different takes on what the laws of logic are.
any definition or utterance, verbal utterance. In order for it to make sense, the reality needs to be intelligible in some way, shape, or form. But let's stick with knowledge. So knowledge, in order for knowledge to be the case, you need truth, you need the uniformity of nature, right? Nature has to work in a regular pattern, in a predictable way. Otherwise, everything would be random and chaotic. We could never.
So really quick, I'm inclined to possibly agree with him, right? That you need order in order to have knowledge, but at the same time, I don't know that that's 100% true, right? If you define knowledge as justified true belief, right? Maybe chaos would be more difficult for externalism, for an externalist epistemic framework. But if you're an internalist, which I am, and most people are, I don't know for sure that like you need the uniformity of nature to have knowledge, right? Again, all you need to have knowledge is a justified true belief. And it's not clear to me that you can't be justified if you don't have uniformity of nature, right? Again, in something, like maybe you can't have justification in induction, but it's not clear to me that you can't have justification at all. And it's not clear to me. And then truth would still hold if you hold to a correspondence theory of truth. That would still hold even if nature is, non-uniform. So it's not clear to me that you need the uniformity of nature to have intelligibility or to have knowledge.
Never state anything with any cogency and coherence. You need the laws of logic. You also need moral absolutes, since we have to have some kind of moral obligation to tell the truth. Otherwise, we would never know or be obligated to, report our findings in an accurate way, so on and so forth. So
what he said right there is really strange. I don't know why you would need moral absolutes at all to have knowledge. He talks about we need moral absolutes because then if you're reporting the knowledge you have, that has nothing to do with actually holding knowledge, right? I can have knowledge in P, I can have knowledge that P, but I can lie to you, I can tell you something else, even though I still have knowledge. So I don't see how, in order to have knowledge, you need moral absolutes. That's completely backwards. All right, it's not just backwards, it's wrong. It's not true. And then the laws of logic. Do you need the laws of logic to have knowledge? Like, do they need to be universal and necessary? Again, that's not clear to me either. Does a dialetheist have knowledge? I don't see how you could say they don't have knowledge, right? And again, it's not like a dialetheist says everything's a contradiction. They allow for contradictions in their worldview, but they might only allow for a couple of contradictions, right? But in their worldview, it's not like the laws of logic are these necessary truths that can't possibly... those truths are not necessary. They're false sometimes. But can a dialetheist still have knowledge? Sure. I don't see why they couldn't. So everything that he's laying out that is a precondition for knowledge is, in my view, it's not true. Okay. And again, he would have to go through these different worldviews one by one, right? He'd have to go into the dialetheist worldview or the externalist worldview or the moral anti-realist worldview and demonstrate that each of those cannot account for knowledge. And that's just three things, right? That's just three things, which has a bunch of different iterations of worldview. So how could he possibly demonstrate the impossibility of the contrary there? I don't see how it's possible. All right.
That's just to list a few. Okay. So what accounts, or which worldview, depending on which worldview you're discussing, which worldview, the Christian worldview or whatever flavor of the non-Christian worldview you're up against.
Sorry, hold on. I wanted to address some of these comments. I appreciate you guys and all the comments. Absolute Optimist says, wait, isn't reliabilism, externalism the popular view? Internalism has issues with animal cognition. I didn't know that. I thought that internalism was the most popular view, but I could absolutely be wrong about that. You might be right. In all the epistemology that I read, most individuals are internalists, but maybe I'm reading the wrong snippet of literature on epistemology. So you could absolutely be correct. I'll have to look that up. The African Animist, good to see you, man. Thanks for being here. I'm assuming this is directed towards me. Why are you reviewing this if you don't understand any of it? I don't know what you're talking about. If you would like to demonstrate what I don't understand, I'm assuming you're talking to me. But anyways, alrighty. Yeah, I mean, if I think that's like, I don't know. I like that's just their way of relieving the cognitive dissonance of, oh, you just don't understand what you're talking about. On the contrary, I think I've talked about this before, but my father-in-law was and is still a precept. We really don't have discussions about precept anymore because why? I mean, I've been with my wife now for almost 20 years. I mean, like together, we've been married. Oh man, how long have we been married? 13 years. But I've been with her for almost 20 years. And so me and him have done this precept dance back and forth. But anyways, I've been looking at precept for almost that amount of time, for about maybe 18, 17 years. So I'm not claiming I'm the expert on presuppositionalist, but I've definitely done my homework. So yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Okay, let's keep going. I really wanted to talk about something that he said right there. So let me rewind really quick.
Way, so on and so forth. So that's just to list a few. Okay, so what accounts, or which worldview, depending on which worldview you're discussing, which worldview, the Christian worldview or whatever flavor of the non-Christian worldview you're up against,
whatever flavor of the non-Christian worldview you're up against. Again, like, yes, if you're having a dialogue with someone who's not a precept, they're going to have a specific flavor of the non-Christian worldview. But refuting that, even assuming you do refute it, does nothing to demonstrate the impossibility of the contrary. Again, you should be able to formulate tag in such a way that you're not even talking to anybody, right? And I think this is why, like, Bonson and Van Til never systematize their argument and never put it into a syllogism, because in that case they know, oh, if I'm putting it into a syllogism, I have to prove the premises, and I'm not talking to anybody, right? I'm not, there's no interlocutor. I myself have the burden of proof, and I have to prove those premises. And so it just doesn't matter who you're talking to. It doesn't matter. So Eli did a debate with Dan Barker, and he talks about how he, attempted to show that Dan Barker's worldview, led to a contradiction. And maybe it does, but again, that doesn't do anything to demonstrate the impossibility of the contrary, right? Refuting Dan Barker's worldview does not demonstrate that only the Christian worldview can account for knowledge. It doesn't work that way. Kyle said, you think Jay would debate Alex O'Connor? I'm sure he would. That would be really interesting to see. I think on a stage that big, Jay would probably behave himself a little more if it was like live in front of an audience. But yeah, that's just the thing. You got to get Jay in a moderated debate, because if you just like call into his show or whatever, he tries to steamroll you. Okay, so Absolute Optimist said externalism is more popular than internalism, and within externalism, reliabilism is the most popular view. Interesting. I did not know that. So thank you. Craig says Alex would lose. He's not Philbro-y enough. I don't know. I mean, Alex knows a lot about philosophy, but I don't know how much he knows about precept. I haven't heard him talk about it too much. But anyways, all right, let's keep going. Okay.
World, you can actually give a rational justification for those things that are needed for knowledge to be possible. This came up in my debate with Dan Barker. Dan Barker is an atheistic materialist. He thinks that all that exists is matter in motion. So what I tried to do to illustrate that point was I asked him, how does something like the laws of logic make sense in that kind of materialistic worldview? Now, this is where the internal critique of the unbeliever comes in, and then I'm going to turn around and show positively how the Christian worldview can account for this, okay?
Again, that won't work. That will not work. I'm sorry if I'm a broken record, but this is the point that needs to be driven home. If you're having a debate with Dan Barker and you're trying to demonstrate that the Christian worldview, again, assuming there is the Christian worldview, which is a problem in and of itself, but assuming that only the Christian worldview can account for knowledge, refuting Dan Barker does nothing. It really doesn't do anything. You have to demonstrate that no contrary worldview can possibly account for knowledge. And I'm sorry, but whatever Dan Barker believes about the laws of logic and about knowledge and about materialism is irrelevant, right? It's irrelevant. And I do appreciate that at least Eli, unlike Jay, because Eli will say, it's his job to perform a reductio of the of his interlocutor's position, Jay puts the onus on them and says, well, how do you account for the laws of logic, and how do you account for intelligibility, which is even worse. At least Eli is trying to put, he's holding the burden himself, but the problem is the burden he's holding is too small, right? He needs to be able to demonstrate that no other possible worldview other than the Christian worldview can possibly account for knowledge. And refuting Dan Barker doesn't do that. Okay. Refuting me doesn't do that. Okay. So it's just the burden is way too high for the impossibility of the contrary. And actually, when I had my discussion with Darwin to Jesus, he calls himself, I'm kind of a preceptor, kind of not, but he even admitted that it's very difficult to do that. He wouldn't go so far to admit that it's impossible. Hey, Sarah, good to see you. I was actually watching one of your videos recently, Sarah, to do research for one of my videos that's coming up. So if you're not subscribed to Sarah, go check her out. Don't check her out, check her video out. All right. Anyways, what was I saying? So, okay, let's keep going.
All is matter in motion, and logic is not matter in motion, then you can't have logic in that view. Yet you need logic to argue against me. Now, Dan Barker is not an idiot. He believes in logic, but only in the sense that it is a function of the brain. Cool. I understand that when I define logic as immaterial conceptual laws that are universal and material invariant, I understand that there is great debate as to how we understand the ontology of logic. But when
So he just admitted something interesting. There's great debate about how we understand the ontology of logic. But see, when in his worldview, he has a specific ontology of what the laws of logic are. And Dan Barker, I guess, I mean, I haven't looked too much into Dan Barker's material. I think I read one of his books like years ago, like 18 years ago. But I don't know much about his ontology, right? But here's the issue. Again, if you look at the Christian worldview, first off, even the Christian worldview, there are disagreements about the laws of logic. Look at somebody like, I was going to say Craig Keener. Look at somebody like William Lane Craig. I don't know how many people are aware that William Lane Craig is a nominalist, and he's a nominalist because he actually thinks that the laws of logic, if you think of them as abstract propositions, they actually provide a problem for the Christian worldview, because then you have necessary existence who themselves, if they're necessary existence, they are ase, or they do not require God to ground them because they're necessary. And so now you have a conflict between God's existence, or excuse me, you have a conflict between God's aseity and abstract propositions like the laws of logic. So it's not even clear that in the Christian worldview, the laws of logic are like this given, and Eli can explain the laws of logic and the non-Christian can't. Even in the Christian worldview, you have issues there. And that's why you have Christians like William Lane Craig, and there's also another, like, I think his name's Dr. Kenneth Boyce, and he's also a nominalist because he recognized these issues. And then if you go to the other side, if you go to the non-Christian worldview, which again, there's no such thing, but you're going to have a multitude of different views about what the laws of logic are. Some people might be Platonists. Some people might be realists, but some people are nominalists. And it sounds like Dan Barker's a nominalist. But you have versions of nominalism that don't rely on like a reductive materialistic framework, right? You have things like fictionalism. I would be interested to see how Eli Ayala would try to refute fictionalism in terms of nominalism. That would be interesting. But anyways, you have to do a lot of legwork there, right? And I just don't see how turning to the law, and that's their favorite thing to turn to, is the laws of logic. All of them, like Jay Dyer, Jim Bob, Andrew Wilson, Father Deacon Ananias, Matt Slick, and Eli and Jason Lyle, like they always want to turn to the laws of logic as if they're just these clear things that the non-believer can account for. And I just don't think that they realize how much debate there is even amongst Christians about the laws of logic. I mean, even amongst Christian flavors, you have absolute creationists, not creationism like young earth creationism. This is creationists about abstract objects. And then you have divine conceptualists, and then you have oh man, what are they called? Theistic activists, and then you have like Platonists, and then you have nominalists. Like even amongst the Christian paradigm, like there's so many different varieties. So for someone like Eli to just talk as if it's quite clear what the laws of logic are and how they're grounded in a theistic framework, that's just not true. That's just not true. I'm going to take a drink of water. Okay. Let me highlight what Absolute Optimist said here, because I think he said something important. Oh, well, Craig also said presuppers have a competitive advantage when debating Platonism, and then he qualified his statement. He meant Platonism and nominalism. So presuppers have a competitive advantage when debating Platonism and nominalism because they are Platonists from the human's perspective, but nominalists from God's. That is true too, the nominalism from God's perspective. I do want to release a video soon about all those issues, about how abstract objects actually pose a problem for the Christian worldview. Because again, presuppers take it as if it grounds the Christian worldview, but on the contrary, I think there's major issues there. Let me see. Absolute Optimist said, there's also a formal system called intuitionist logic, which is used in constructive mathematics, denies the law of excluded middle, and intuitionist logic is not paraconsistent logic. That's true. That's something I haven't read up on too much, but it is. I have a couple books coming up really soon that I want to read up on that stuff. But yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Like, there's so many different views, even when it comes to logic. Like, and again, I hadn't even brought this up, that there's also paraconsistent logics, right? Like, how would Eli go about refuting that? He would try to do an internal critique, or again, like something like trivialism, and try to show that there's a contradiction. But the somebody who holds to paraconsistent logic, like the dialetheist, will just say, yeah, and like, so what? In my formal system, in my paradigm, I admit of contradictions. What is Eli going to say at that point? He can't say, well, you admit of contradictions, so I just did a reductio of your worldview. Well, no, that's assuming that you can't have contradictions, which the dialetheist will not hold to. So, all right. And then Sarah said, Stephen, you should do a video about Darth Dawkins. It's way more fun. I don't know about fun. Like, so right now I have a video on Andrew Wilson that I'm itching to get out, because I feel like not too many people have done videos on just all the ways he contradicts himself. So I'm really itching to get that out. But Jesus Christ, I've watched so many freaking hours of Andrew Wilson that it's like, I wouldn't wish that on anybody. It's just a pain in the ass. But Darth Dawkins, I don't know. Maybe, I just don't know, because he's not like a prominent presupper anymore. Like, I just don't see him around anymore. I don't know. Maybe I would, but it definitely wouldn't be at the top of my list. I'd rather shit on Jay or Jim Bob, since they're still at the forefront here. And then Honest Doubter says, but I mean, if enough people wanted me to do one on Darth Dawkins, I wouldn't mind. Warship, I think, is saying like, yeah, you should. Anyways, okay. And again, the Pyronist who says, I make no claim of truth. How does one prove that stance is impossible? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, again, the onus is on Eli. The onus is on the presupper, who has to do all the legwork here. And I just don't see how you can possibly do all that. Okay, let's keep going. And we're not going to watch this whole thing, guys. I know we're only 13 minutes in. I think towards the end of the interview, they talk about other stuff, and they talk about Islam and other things. So we're not going to cover the whole thing. In fact, I had another interview with Eli that I also wanted to highlight. But I definitely don't want to be here for 3 hours looking at that stuff. So maybe let's keep going, and I'll shut my mouth. Okay.
Arguing is, with that debate notwithstanding, if you don't take logic in the way that I've defined it, then you're going to run into some problems. So Dan Barker believes logic is a function of the brain. Cool. Okay. If it's a function of the brain, then it's limited to brains. And if it's limited to brains, it's not universal. And if it's not universal, then it's not applicable across the board. I can contradict you and you can't say I'm wrong, because that's just my brain functioning in a different way than Dan Barker's brain is functioning. All right. So Dan Barker can assert.
So I'm not going to comment too much about that. Let's even assume that that's a valid argument, or that that's a sound argument. That would really only work against like an eliminative materialist, which I'm not even sure Dan Barker is. But again, they're like, take somebody who's a nominalist, who's maybe not a materialist, but maybe they're a fictionalist. Like that won't work, right? What he's saying there won't work to refute their position.
This is what I think logic is. And in doing so, I'm going to critique the insufficiency of that on his own terms. Now, someone turns around and say, cool, materialistic atheism cannot account for logic in a meaningful way. Congratulations, Eli, you did a great job, blah, 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 pat me on the back, pop the bottle of champagne. By the way, my debate with Dan Barker went extremely well, and there was lots and lots of positive feedback as a result of that debate. I thought it was pretty cool. Thanks to the Lord for that. That was my first debate. I was a little nervous going in at first, but I think he blessed that interaction quite a bit. But nevertheless, someone says, cool. Well, how do you account for logical principles in a Christian worldview? Now, this is where it's very important to understand that apologetics.
So this is what's interesting. He's talking about how are laws of logic grounded on a Christian worldview, and this is what I was just talking about. How there's tons of different views about how to ground laws of logic, because it's actually not straightforward. Like they like to say, oh, well, the laws of logic describe God's nature, or they are God's nature, or something like that. And these all run into issues. This is why there's so many different. This is why William Craig's a nominalist, because he sees that there's issues here.
Apologetics is a defense of the Christian system of truth. And so when we're defending or offering a positive case for the Christian faith, we need to kind of know our faith. And this is why when I talk about the importance of knowing our worldview, I typically focus on kind of the three pillars of every worldview. That is the pillars of metaphysics, which refers to our theory of reality. What do we think is real? What do we think is possible and impossible? That's a feature of our view of reality. There's epistemology, which is one's theory of knowledge that typically asks the question, how do we know what we know? Not just how do we know God exists, but how do we know anything? What you say with respect to that question is going to evince your epistemology, and then your ethics. How should we live our lives? Okay. Now, from a Christian metaphysical perspective, the foundation of a Christian metaphysic is the creator-creature distinction. This comes straight out of Genesis 1. People say, well, are you referring to the Bible? Yes, you're asking me, Mr. Skeptic, how do I account as a Christian for the laws of logic, which are one of the necessary preconditions for knowledge? Obviously, I'm going to have to refer to the Bible, because within my worldview, it's the Word of God, and it informs me as to the nature of reality. So it would be very inconsistent of me to try to answer those questions without referring to my source of authority on these issues. Okay, so we'll talk about what happens if the unbeliever rejects the Bible. We can talk about that if you're interested. But nevertheless, we have the creator-creature distinction, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created. So we have God, and then we have creation. So everything that is not God is created, and that means God.
Okay, so it's really important. He said a bunch of stuff there. I'm not going to jump on the whole Bible thing. I think that's because it's not crucial to the impossibility of the contrary. That's another issue. But he talks about this creator-creature distinction, and he says everything that is not God is created. Okay, so if everything that is not God is created, are the laws of logic God? They're propositions, so you can't say a proposition is God. Okay, right? That doesn't make any sense. Like you can say and again, this is where apologists will say, well, the laws of logic are part of God's nature, which again, I don't know what that means, because laws of logic are propositions. How can you say a proposition is part of someone's nature? You can maybe say a proposition describes someone's nature, but to say a proposition is part of someone's nature, to me, doesn't really make any sense. But if the laws of logic are propositions, and everything that is not God is created, and propositions are not literally identical with God, then those propositions are created, right? Which would likely make them what? Not necessary? If they're created, right? God could abstain from creating them, couldn't he? So then how are those laws necessary? The other issue is, and this is just the issue with trying to marry abstract objects with God. Let's forget about the laws of logic. Let's take the proposition God exists. If you're a theist, you probably hold that the proposition God exists is necessary, But did God create that proposition? Right? The proposition God exists is not identical with God. It's a proposition that describes reality. But did God create the proposition God exists? Well, he would need to exist first in order to do that. But the proposition would be true before he created that proposition. So see, these are the issues with like abstract objects and propositions, necessary propositions like God exists or the laws of logic, and trying to ground them in God. You run into issues. And this is, again, why there's so many different facets of like Platonism and realism with regards to abstract objects. So Eli says these things like everything that is not God is created, and I think he seems to not understand that this actually creates problems for his view, especially when we're talking about laws of logic. So let me look at the comments because I saw a bunch of them. Let's see. I presuppose that Dan Barker can't lose a debate. Tell Dan Barker that. I don't know how he did in that debate. I haven't watched it. Sarah said there's a video called Andrew Wilson Gets Destroyed by 20-year-old Objectivist Philosopher. It's about rights being facts. I will have to check that out because, again, I've been watching all of his debates, and what I'm looking for are specific nuggets, like, because half the time he's just interrogating his interlocutor, but I'm looking for, where he promulgates his own view. And so I've had to watch so many freaking hours of that guy, but thanks for bringing that up. I'll have to check it out. Yes, Andrew Pickle Jar Wilson. Although he makes it clear that it wasn't a pickle jar, it was an olive jar. So it's like, okay. So I'm sure in my video I'll reference it. I'll have to make sure we say that it's an olive jar. He's such a douche though, man. I mean, I watched his debate with Dillahunty where he just like you could tell he really that's what he wanted. He wanted to get Dillahunty to rage quit. And then I was watching his debate with Craig. I don't know the guy's full name, but he was doing a debate with Craig, and he threw a stray at Dillahunty, talking about how Dillahunty's sucking off his boyfriend or something. He's such a jerk, man. Anyways, anywho, so 40,000 denominations agree God's word is clear. So for those of you that weren't here at the beginning, I was going to do a different stream today, and I was going to do a stream about something that I posted on Twitter. And yes, I still call it Twitter because fuck Elon Musk. I'm not going to call it X. So something that I posted on Twitter, and it went semi-viral amongst the apologist accounts, and it was about my video on divine communication, which I think is a very, very persuasive argument against the existence of the Christian God. But anyways, I put it in a syllogism, and it went pretty viral. So that's what I wanted to cover today, because the apologetic response to it, I thought, was not good, but I wanted to go through it because I thought it was really interesting, because I think it's a good argument, and I just haven't heard many good rejoinders to it. But it's based on that there's so many different Christian denominations, and then they want to say God's word is clear, and it's anything but. Anything but. Who sounds like the Wilson? Oh, Wilson sounds exactly like the guy from All the Sandler. Dude, that is true. Yeah, I know which guy you're talking about, and I don't know his name, but he's one of Sandler's guys, and he's in all of his movies. I never thought about that. They do have similar speech pattern. Anyways, all right, let's keep going. Thank you guys for being here. Where are we? Okay.
God transcends his creation. He's beyond creation. He's not limited to physicality. That's why we believe, according to John 4:24, God is spirit. In the book of Psalms, it teaches that this God who is spirit is everywhere present. So he is omnipresent spirit. So he's not limited by space, time, matter and energy and these sorts of things. Okay. Now, if God is a spirit and he is an everywhere present spirit, okay, God is a being. He is a mind, if you will, without a body. Okay. He's incorporeal. Now, you could learn this in any basic Christian systematic theology. There's a whole section in systematic theologies on the incorporeality of God. God is not physical. Now, if God is an unembodied mind, okay, and then we take a look at the laws of logic. What are the laws of logic? Are the laws of logic material or immaterial?
So I want to This is important because it seems like Eli's presenting a true dichotomy, right? Are the laws of logic material or are they immaterial? But that's assuming that you're giving some sort of ontology to the laws of logic. That's assuming that you can say, yeah, the laws of logic are these things out there, so they must be either material or immaterial. But not everyone would agree that the laws of logic are these things that can even be characterized as material or immaterial. If you're a nominalist of some variety, you would probably reject that, right? Like a fictionalist would not, that would be a false dichotomy because they don't even agree that there are these things called the laws of logic, right? They believe that the laws of logic are like these useful fictions that we use. So yeah, I mean, it's weird to call that a false dichotomy because it seems like a true dichotomy, right? It's either immaterial or it's material. But again, that's assuming that the laws of logic have like this ontology, that they're like out there somewhere. And I certainly wouldn't agree with that. I myself am very, for any of you who have read up on like realism and nominalism, it's so convoluted. Like there's so many different views, and like there's good arguments for Platonism, there's good arguments against Platonism, there's good arguments for nominalism, there's good arguments against nominalism. It's a really, really tough landscape to figure out where you want to land. And I think it's harder for theists because they have to be committed to God. And so they have to find a way to fit that into their worldview. So I actually think for someone like Eli, it's actually harder to incorporate something like the laws of logic into your worldview, believe it or not. I think most precepts would laugh at that, but that's actually true. But for me, I don't have any horse in this race, right? So I'm just trying to figure out what the hell's going on. Like, do abstract objects actually exist, or should I be a nominalist? There's so many good arguments in both directions that I'm very much agnostic on that issue. So it's just not clear, right? That you can just categorize something like the laws of logic as either material or immaterial. They might not be these ontological objects at all, and nominalism could be correct, some form of nominalism. All right, let's keep going. We're doing good.
If you say material, logic loses its universality, and then you undercut the preconditions of intelligible experience. If you say it's immaterial, I'm going to ask, okay, is it conceptual? If it's conceptual, where do concepts reside? Where must concepts reside? Well, concepts reside in minds.
So he makes a jump here. And here's the thing, like, I think Eli's, to his credit, he's just kind of sketching out the positive case for grounding laws of logic on his worldview, supposedly. He might articulate this differently in a debate, but notice he jumped from, okay, if they're immaterial, then are they conceptual? But he never considers the possibility, like, are they not conceptual, right? Because one of the positions you can have as a Platonist is, yeah, they're immaterial, but they're not conceptual, right? They're not like a concept within God's mind, because that's where Eli's going. He's trying to go to divine conceptualism, which is just one position that a theist can take. But I kind of already explained a little while ago why, the issues with that. But he jumped straight from immaterial to conceptual. First, you would have to demonstrate that in order for the laws of logic to be immaterial, well, then they must be conceptual. But they don't have to be conceptual. They can be immaterial and non-conceptual. They can just be part of the Platonic horde. And of course, he's going to say, well, there's issues with Platonism. I mean, granted, I agree there's issues with Platonism, but there's issues with divine conceptualism as well. And that's my point. Like, there's issues with all these different facets of realism with regards to propositions and laws of logic and abstract objects. And there's problems with Eli's view as well with divine conceptualism. So, all right, let's keep going.
Well, are the laws of logic universal? If you say no, that undercuts the preconditions of intelligibility. If you say,
so he said, are the laws of logic universal? If so, or if you say no, you undercut the preconditions of intelligibility. Again, I don't know that that's true. And this is what we've been talking about. Like, what if you accept a pair consistent logic? That doesn't mean you're undercutting the preconditions of intelligibility. Not necessarily. You would have to demonstrate that. Remember, so somebody who holds a pair consistent logic, like a dialetheist, they're not claiming that. They're not like the trivialist that claims, well, all contradictions are true. They just claim that some contradictions can be true because they reject the principle of explosion, I believe. So And it's not clear to me on a dialetheist worldview that they can't have the preconditions of intelligibility, whatever those are, that they can't have knowledge, and there's no uniformity of nature and whatnot. You would have to demonstrate that. And again, he makes these broad sweeping statements, and they just don't work. This is the whole point of this. Like, the impossibility of the contrary here is not going to be demonstrated by this type of argumentation. It's just not. All right.
Yes, now you have a universal conceptual laws, which are by nature conceptual. So where do concepts exist? Well, they must exist in a mind. They're not going to be grounded in a finite mind. They're universal. So they have to transcend finite minds. And therefore, it must be a reflection of a infinite mind, which we call God specifically.
Okay, so again, he's promulgating divine conceptualism here, and there's issues with that, because remember earlier he said everything that's not God is created by God. Well, again, God might be able to conceive of a proposition, he might be able to conceive of the laws of logic, but those propositions are not identical with God, so then God must have created those thoughts, right? But if God created those thoughts, then how are they necessary? Couldn't God have not created? Couldn't God have not thought about the laws of logic? Could he have thought about different laws, right? And then in that case, again, we run into the issue of, so first off, that demonstrates that the laws of logic, on his view, how can they be called necessary? And then two, we have kind of like a divine bootstrapping problem, which is if we take necessary propositions to be divine concepts or divine thoughts, this brings up the issue I talked about earlier, where take the proposition God exists. Does that proposition only exist because God thought of it, because God conceived of it? Well, how can that be possible? Because that proposition would first need to be true in order for God to think of it, right? You have this circular issue, this divine bootstrapping problem. That's what it's called, the bootstrapping problem. There's different iterations of it, but that's one of them. So again, Eli's position here runs into issues. So again, his whole point is we have the Christian worldview and then we have the non-Christian worldview. He's not able to demonstrate the non-Christian, because there is no the non-Christian worldview. So he's not able to demonstrate the non-Christian worldview is false. But then even here, the Christian worldview that he's supposedly, or that he's, propagating here has issues as well. I felt like I was a newscaster. It has issues as well. Back to you, Eli.
The God of the Bible. So I'm not using this argument as a demonstration of a generic theism. It's specifically the Christian God, because that's the only God that exists. God as a triunity.
That was really strange for him to say. It's the God of the Bible because that's the only God that exists. You have to demonstrate that. How? I mean, you could be a divine conceptualist and be a Muslim, right? Like, you have to do a little bit more work here. And I'm not saying he can't. I'm sure he knows that he has to do a little bit more work. I would hope that, because again, Eli seems like a smart guy, and he's a very, very good faith individual. But yeah, you have to do a lot of work there. You can't just say it's the God of the Bible because that's the only God that exists. I mean, that's yeah, it's a big burden.
He also imposes his order onto reality. Reality reflects God's nature to a certain degree, because in reality we see both particularity, many things.
Here you're going to see him articulate a common argument of J. Dyer, the one in the many, how Christianity solves the problem of the one in the many.
And unity, oneness that brings them together. You have logical principles, that's a universal, that brings together into meaningful relationship the many particulars, the many things we see in reality. So then we have to ask the question, which worldview, atheism, Islam, any form of Unitarianism, any form of atheism, can give a rational account for both unity and diversity that we see in human experience? This is not a silly question to ask. It's not a stupid question to ask. In fact, it actually occupies a lot of thought in the period of the pre-Socratics. The philosophers before Socrates were grappling with what is the nature of reality? How do we bring into meaningful relationship the unity and the plurality that we see? If you say that ultimate reality is a unity, ultimately, then the multiplicity that we see becomes illusory. That's a problem. If you say, well, ultimate reality is ultimately speaking, metaphysically, it's ultimately many things. Well, then you lose the undergirding unity that brings all those many things into meaningful relationship. And so whether you are saying that reality is a fundamental...
So he's highlighting the problem of the one and the many, right? Right now, he's just highlighting that, and then he's going to talk about how the solution to that is the Christian God because of the Trinity.
Unity, or it's a fundamental plurality, both of those options are going to undercut the necessary preconditions for intelligibility. And that's why we say that it is only within the triune God, within Christian thought, Christian worldview, God is equally ultimate, one and many. He is one as to his being. He is many as to his persons. That is our doctrine of the Trinity. There is one being who is God, who exists as three simultaneous co-eternal persons who are denominated the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So the triune God, being one and many, is the metaphysical basis for the one and the many that we see in reality. And without an accounting for that, you lose all intelligible experience, because anything that is intelligible is going to presuppose the unity of both oneness and manyness.
So to me, this is just slapping a label, right? Like, the Trinity itself is such a hard thing to conceive of, precisely because of the problem of the one and the many. Like, this is really a case of he's explaining a mystery by positing a bigger mystery. He's like, let me show you how we explain the problem of, or how we solve the problem of the one and the many. We're just going to posit some being that's one and also many. That doesn't solve the issue, right? Like, I have yet to hear a model of the Trinity that doesn't either just make no sense or isn't incoherent. So yeah, I mean, this is just a case of trying to solve a mystery by appealing to a bigger mystery. Like, somehow saying that, well, we solved the problem of the one and the many by positing a God who is one but also many. It just pushes the problem back. It doesn't help me understand or ground the problem of the one and the many at all. Like, it doesn't do that at all. You're just saying, here's the problem with the one and the many, and then here's this God that's one and also many. And my question would still be, okay, how in the hell is that possible? Like, that doesn't solve the issue. It just makes me scratch my head more. All righty. Let's keep going. Where are we at? I think we just have a few more clips to look at. Again, I did want to look at a subsequent interview, but I actually feel like I've said most of what needs to be said in terms of what Eli had already talked about. I feel like he's been talking for a long time, and Kelvin and Josiah haven't asked him questions in a while. But anyways, let's keep going. Actually, let's look at some comments here. I don't know. Seems like you guys are getting into some good back and forth in the comment section. Eli Ayala would get wrecked in a debate with, oh yeah, on Unitarianism. I don't know. I mean, I don't, again, I like Eli. I don't know exactly, how well versed he is in like that type of Aristotelian or scholastic type of philosophy. I don't know. Somebody also asked earlier, what did they ask? They asked something about Roman Catholics and Orthodox. That was a long time ago. I think somebody asked, who's worse? Roman Catholics, or I can't find the comment. Roman Catholics, or was it Orthodox? I don't remember. Anyways, sorry if I lost your comment. There's so many comments. Trinity violates the Bible too. Yeah, I mean, to me, it's not clear at all that. I mean, you can find verses in Scripture that you can say, "Oh, this points to the Trinity," but there's no clear explication of the Trinity. It's not explicitly taught in Scripture, I don't think. But yeah, I agree. Well, and so I don't know if I would say it violates the Bible. I would just say I don't know that it's there as clearly as they claim it is. And then Sarah said, as an ex-Muslim, the Trinity was the biggest issue that kept me away from Christianity. It brings more problems than it solves. Yeah, I'm trying to think back to when I was a Christian, like what I thought of it. I just really didn't. I just kind of put it in the box of it's a divine mystery, and I really didn't try to flesh it out too much. And it was one of my first beliefs that I jettisoned as I was losing my faith, because it just was, I don't know. And maybe that was my fault. I didn't research it enough, but I keep forgetting you were an ex-Muslim, Sarah. I forgot. Okay. All right. Absolute Optimist says Trinity is heavily controversial. Even still, Tim Paul has issues with RIT. Left Out has his model. Craig has his. Yeah, I mean, there's so many. That's the thing too. Like, there's so many different models. Like, you refute one model, and they're like, well, but there's this model, and then there's this model, and so on and so forth. Like, yeah, there's so many different ones. I know the one I've looked into the most is Branson's. Like what is it called? Oh, monarchical Trinitarianism. I think that's the one that Inspiring Philosophy holds to, and I think that's why I've dealt with it, because I've dealt with some of his stuff. But dialetheism for the Trinity would be a good stream topic. That would be interesting. Yeah, and then Branson and Sijuade. Yeah, okay. All right. Let's move on. We're almost done here. Again, I know we're only halfway through the interview, but towards the end, they kind of start talking about other stuff really related to just Christians.
So how do we know the Christian God provides the necessary preconditions for intelligibility? Because given his metaphysical nature, okay, his nature provides that which is needed for knowledge to be possible. That's in a nutshell. That's a lot. I'll let you ask the question, and then I can continue on if you'd like, because there's a little bit more to unpack. But obviously, it's a big question. You can't just do it in 2 seconds.
No, you did great. So here's the thing, and again, is like I said, we're in this world of the social media apologists and philosophers now, right? Explain to me though, if I'm confronted with this type of question, how does that argument? So you gave a positive argument and a negative argument to others, but one of the key parts of Bonson's view and Van Til's view is the idea of the impossibility to the contrary.
So this is interesting because Kelvin is picking up on, again, so in case you got here late, this individual, Kelvin, seems like a really nice dude. He commented on my Jay Dyer video and said that he had watched it, and because of that, because of some of my objections, this is why he wanted to have Eli on. He wanted to bounce some ideas off of Eli. And he's picked up that based on what Eli's just said, Eli hasn't really demonstrated the impossibility of the contrary. And he asked Eli about this. And I don't know if Eli didn't exactly understand his question, but Eli doesn't really address it. He kind of addresses something else. But yeah, this guy Kelvin's basically asking, like, how does that demonstrate the impossibility of the contrary? I believe so, if I remember. Let me just back up a little bit so he can articulate his question again.
How does that argument? So you gave a positive argument and a negative argument to others, but one of the key parts of Bonson's view and Van Til's view is the idea of the impossibility to the contrary. And so how does that, what you just gave as your argument, how does that demonstrate that there couldn't be some other precondition that accomplishes the same thing? His tag perhaps set its standard too high, at least in the philosophical realm, by
See, and that's my argument. Tag has absolutely set its standard too high, because even what Eli's articulated throughout this entire interview will not possibly demonstrate the impossibility of the contrary. At best, at absolute best, it would demonstrate his worldview can account for something. Doesn't mean it's true, but his worldview can account for something, and the person who he's talking to, their worldview can't. That doesn't even demonstrate that the Christian worldview is true, let alone that no other possible worldview can be true. Right? So all Eli's done up until this point will not demonstrate the impossibility of the contrary. And Kelvin has picked up on that. And that's what he's asking about. And Eli doesn't really address it. I don't know if Eli, and again, Eli's a really smart dude. I don't know if he misunderstood the question or if he maybe just didn't understand what Kelvin was driving at.
Claiming that it's impossible, that any other idea, or maybe I've mischaracterized the idea of the impossibility contrary, and you could explain that so that we could help others. But has the bar been set too high? Should it be rephrased? Or how would you actually defend that view of the impossibility of the contrary?
Well, I don't think the bar has been set high, because the bar has been set by Scripture. Transcendental argumentation is philosophical language, but it is an expression of a biblical truth that there is only one God. Everything else that claims the authority is a false authority. That is my commitment as a Christian. If you believe the Bible, that ought to be a Christian's commitment. right? We love God more than everything else. We are to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, and mind. We're to love the Lord our God more than our parents, more than our children, all the rest. And so that very God that I'm supposed to love with all my heart, I'm not going to start arguing about him as though he may or may not exist, depending on where the evidence, wherever the weights of the evidence points to. You see, so I think.
So this is where being a precept, it just really. Being a precept is just not, in my view, it's very irrational, because what Eli's saying is, look, no, the burden set by the impossibility of the contrary can't be too high because Scripture says it can't be too high. I mean, again, that's based on his interpretation of Scripture. But the point here is that Eli is not amendable to evidence. He's not going to change his position based on evidence because he already has his conclusion as a presupposition. And this is another issue, this is a separate issue with presuppositionalism, right? I mean, it's just they're irrational because they're not coming to the evidence and saying, let's see where the evidence points, right? And again, I know what they're going to say. Well, because you can't just come to the evidence like with a blank slate. You're coming to the evidence with presuppositions, and that's fine. But your presuppositions should also be amendable to evidence. Like, it's not like your presuppositions are just set in stone, right? You should still try to do your best to erase your bias as much as you can, to be neutral as much as you can, right? So the precepts like to say, they like to propagate the myth of neutrality. And again, I would agree, nobody can be completely neutral, but you, in my opinion, you should try to be as neutral as you can. You should try to follow the evidence where it leads as best as you can, even if that evidence seems to run counter to some of your quote unquote presuppositions. So in my opinion, Eli's just being irrational here, right? He's demonstrating that he's not following the evidence. He has his presuppositions firmly in place, and nothing's going to budge that, right? And evidence will not deter him, which to me is pretty much just a textbook definition of irrationality, right? You're just admitting that you're not going to follow the evidence, right? Because you already think you have everything figured out in terms of your presuppositions. Okay, let's keep going. All right.
I think the transcendental argument is setting the standard is set because it's based upon a scriptural standard. It's God or nothing, God or chaos, right? So I don't think that it's overly.
So really quick, again, he's not answering Kelvin's question. Kelvin's question was, how is what you've set up so far, how does that demonstrate the impossibility of the contrary? Because remember, he said, if you're refuting your interlocutor's worldview, how does that demonstrate that no other possible worldview can ground the preconditions of intelligibility, right? Is the standard set too high? And now Eli's just rattling off things about the Bible, which again, I mean, he's a Christian. He absolutely can do that, but it's not really answering the question, right? I mean, will Eli entertain the possibility that the impossibility of the contrary is too big a burden, and so maybe his interpretation of Scripture is incorrect, right? Would he do that? I don't know. But again, that to me, that just demonstrates that he's being irrational here, but he's not answering Kelvin's initial question.
Really ambitious. I mean, it's ambitious to someone who already comes from a perspective that says, how could we know such things, right? They already come from a perspective that they don't think we could know these things for certain, right? We're coming from the perspective, standing on Scripture, that we can know these things for certain. We can have a justification for these things. And the unbeliever is literally on apologetus. He is without an apologetic, because the God that proclaims himself in Scripture is known by everyone without exception. Yeah. So I don't think the standard is too high. I think it's reflecting a biblical truth.
Absolutely.
So I would ask Eli, and this is a question I've asked. This is a question I would ask my father-in-law again, because he's a presupper. I would ask him, how do you know you're not misinterpreting Scripture, right? Here's the thing: precepts like to ground human reason in Scripture, but the problem there is you need human reason, right? Human reason is epistemically prior to Scripture, right? So first off, Eli's basing all of this on his interpretation of Scripture, but how does he even know that he's interpreting Scripture correctly? He needs to know something about his reason and his cognitive faculties and all that before he can even approach Scripture and assume that he's interpreting things correctly. This is a minor point, I think, but when he's appealing to, well, Scripture says this and Scripture says that, and Scripture needs to be our presupposition. First off, I don't even know how it can necessarily, since, again, human reason is epistemically prior to, I'm not saying it's ontologically prior, but it's epistemically prior. Human reason is epistemically prior to Scripture. And these are questions that I just don't, I'd be interested to hear his answer. Sorry, I'm just reading some of the comments. Sometimes I don't know if you guys are, when you're talking to each other, if you're talking to me. So, okay, we're almost done here, guys. Thanks for staying. We're almost done.
And as you know, I well agree with you. My question is have we entered into the wrong realm then? Have we, by turning it into a syllogism and answering it in that?
Actually, they're going to talk about something related to how tag relates to Christianity. I believe it's just not something that I feel the need to cover, but I do want to cover this over here.
Is a problem at all.
As part of the presuppositional approach, you spend a lot of time, showing how competing worldviews fail to provide what Christianity can. So I guess putting that into practice, materialistic naturalism is a really influential worldview today. I would say most of the people that I interact with online or even in real life, they don't know they are, but that would kind of be their philosophy. Why does materialistic naturalism fail to provide the necessary preconditions for intelligibility?
So, no knock against Josiah here, but that question to me would be irrelevant, even if you do believe that. What does he say? Materialistic naturalism fails to provide the preconditions of intelligibility. Even if you think that that's true, that doesn't demonstrate the impossibility of the contrary. It doesn't do anything, in my opinion, right? It doesn't demonstrate that there's no other possible worldview other than Christianity that can account for these preconditions. So, and again, I don't know exactly why Josiah was asking him that, but let's keep going.
Well, first, just to give a caveat, not all atheists are materialistic. You do have atheism that affirms immaterial realities and things like that. So if we want to address that later, we can. But if materialism is true and all that exists is matter and motion, then that negates certain necessary preconditions for knowledge that must be non-physical. For example, I use the example of logic. If you're a materialistic atheist, then I'm going to ask you to give a rational justification for logic in a way that's consistent with your worldview. Now, a knowledgeable atheist being consistent with his view, he's going to have some materialistic, functional kind of understanding of logic, in which case I'm going to critique in the exact same way I did of Dan Barker's position. Dan Barker, while not the best atheist representative, he's not an idiot. He obviously understands, well, I'm going to appeal to logic and do all these sorts of things. But again, is his appeal to logic as he understands it, does that undercut his own position or does it help his position? If all that exists is matter and you reduce logic to matter, then material logic is not universal. And if it's not universal, then why should I care if you think I'm committing a contradiction? Maybe my brain says it's not a contradiction. So
So really quick, like you could be a fictionalist and a materialist, right? So Dan Barker could be a fictionalist. I don't know if he is, but you could still be a fictionalist. And to answer Eli's question, well, then why should I care? If the laws of logic aren't universal, why should I care? Well, it's because the laws of logic fit within this fictional paradigm and they're useful, right? I would say that that's a good reason. And again, I'm not a fictionalist, but I'm just saying these are the tools available to somebody like that, right? They also, a fictionalist would claim that math is fictional, right? So you could also ask, well, why should I care about math? And it's well, because it's a useful fiction, right? It's not so a fictionalist would say there's no number two, there's no platonic number two out there, right? But the two is a useful fiction that we use, and we use it in math. And so, yeah, it's not as if it's not as if the materialist can't play a game here that makes use of logic, right? and there are different varieties of nominalism. So again, it's just arguing against Dan Barker's specific form of materialism. It just doesn't do anything for the impossibility of the contrary.
It's just my physical brain functioning in a particular way versus your brain, functioning in a particular way. So if the materialistic atheist wants to account for knowledge, he's going to have some view of logic, which is one of the necessary preconditions. He has to understand that in a way that would allow for logical principles and universals and things like that. And in his world, you can't. Given his own perspective, it can. It's not even from my Christian perspective, from an atheistic perspective. How do you make sense out of universal conceptual laws? You're going to have to take their universality away. But then once you do that, then okay, who cares? I'll just contradict you, and it doesn't really matter on your own view.
So again, like it just, when it comes to internal critiques, like some of the stuff he's talking about just won't work. Again, and you could have an atheist Platonist. Like there are atheist Platonists or agnostic Platonists. Like I think Joe Schmidt, he's an agnostic, if I am characterizing him correctly. And I believe he said that he leans closer to Platonism. I think he's like me in that he doesn't have his mind made up on the matter. But I think in an interview, he said if he had to pick one, it would be Platonism. So I mean, there's, you can have an atheist position that still checks all these boxes that Eli thinks need to be checked in order to have preconditions of intelligibility, and you can still be an atheist, right? I mean, again, now Eli would say, okay, well, we can go in and refute the atheist Platonist. Like, okay, but that's just assuming that's correct, right? You're just taking one small fraction of the non-belief of the non-Christian worldview, and you still have a lot more work cut out for you. And then we have the issues with the Christian worldview. Again, I don't believe that there is a Christian worldview. Again, even talking about laws of logic or abstract objects, as we talked about earlier, like there's so many different varieties of it. So yeah, I think that's all that I wanted to cover. Again, I did want to go to another interview of Eli's, but I think at this point, I think I would just be repeating myself unnecessarily. I really think I'd be making the same points. But again, I really appreciate Kelvin and I guess Josiah too, but I'm assuming this is Kelvin's channel, for reaching out. And again, I appreciate how honest he was. He was like, I think some of the points you made are intriguing, and he wanted to bounce them off of Eli. So I really appreciate their honesty. Again, I do like Eli. He seems like a really good faith individual. It'd be great to have a discussion with him. It'd be great if he saw this. It would also, it would be, I think, I don't know, Kelvin and Josiah might even be watching. And if you guys are watching, thanks for watching. I think I said this at the beginning. Did Sarah say, how are you holding on, Steve? I don't know. I'm trying. I also, at the beginning of the stream, I wasn't feeling too good. And I was like, man, like, how is this going to go? But I feel much better, surprisingly. Maybe presuppositionalist is the cure to not feeling well. But I don't know. I'm holding on. But yeah, anyways, Kelvin, and I keep wanting to say Kevin. I'm sure he gets it all the time. Kelvin and Josiah, if you guys are watching, thanks for watching. And so I brought up all these objections to Kelvin, by the way. After I told him that I watched his interview with this interview right here, after I told him I watched it, he wanted to know my thoughts. And I told him, well, you could just watch the stream and you'll know my thoughts. But he said, well, but we're having a follow-up interview with Eli yesterday. And so I was like, that's cool. I'll go ahead and type out my thoughts. So I typed out pretty much not everything, but a lot of the stuff that we just talked about in the stream. And so I don't know if they were going to bring some of those questions again to Eli. I think they might. So that'll be interesting. So, I mean, keep an eye out on Kelvin's channel. And again, they seem like good dudes, subscribe if you would like. And I'll be interested to see their follow-up interview with Eli and to see if he answers some of these issues or some of these questions that I had. All right. Well, feel free to put in any comments you'd like me to answer before we log off here. We've been going almost 2 hours. Yeah, I guess I'm not going to stream at night anymore. I streamed like 2 weeks ago at night, and there weren't too many people that showed up, but people seem to like to show up to the day ones. Thanks, Sarah. I appreciate it. Again, guys, if you're not subscribed to Sarah's channel, go check it out. She does a lot on Islam as well, because she was a former Muslim, and I don't know why I keep forgetting that, but thanks for showing up. I appreciate it. Yeah, I think at some point, either later on this week or next week, I'm going to do a stream based on that Twitter exchange, which I thought was really interesting. Again, the argument that I put forward, I think, is a very persuasive argument, and I didn't get very good objections from Christians. Anyways, Absolute Optimist. Thanks. Would love to chat with you sometime, Stephen. Yeah, dude, absolutely. I barely saw your first comment, and I don't know if that was your first comment, but I saw your comment on my channel. I don't know if it was yesterday or today. And so I will check out your channel. I'll subscribe. And we can plan on doing something in the future. You seem very knowledgeable about a lot of this stuff. So I would definitely, we can plan something for the future, and we can keep in contact. So thanks. I appreciate it. And we'll see if we can keep in touch. All right. It doesn't look like there's too many questions for me, which is fine. So yeah, like I said, I usually schedule my live streams like a day in advance. So just keep an eye out for future ones. Let me see this. So the African animist. Thanks for educating, Stephen. I would be curious if you can compile worldviews that debunk the impossibility of the contrary claim. I've been finding that pantheism, monism, deism work. Well, so we've talked about this ad nauseum, but just look at something like trivialism. I don't even think trivialism is true, obviously, but when trying to push the impossibility of the contrary, you have to do an internal critique. And again, you have to be able to do it. And you either have to find some worldview that is all encompassing, which I don't think that that's possible. Although I guess you could say trivialism is all encompassing because it encompasses all propositions. I guess you could say that, but, or you have to find an all encompassing worldview and refute that, show that it leads to a contradiction. Or you would have to go one by one to every worldview, which again, there's tons of iterations of worldviews. But anyways, so take trivialism. How could you possibly perform an internal critique of trivialism, right? You would have to show that it leads to a contradiction, but under trivialism, there's nothing wrong with contradictions, right? The only thing somebody like Eli or the Precept can do is say, well, from my external position to trivialism, I have a problem with contradictions. That's fine, but then you're no longer doing an internal critique. You're doing some sort of externalist critique, and that won't work for the impossibility of the contrary. So yeah, I mean, I think I've done, a lot of videos on the impossibility of the contrary and talked about why it just doesn't work. But I don't know. I mean, we'll see what the future holds. Right now, I'm trying to work on a video on Andrew Wilson, and again, I've done tons of hours of research. I have some more research to do before I start putting a pen to paper and start writing stuff up. But keep an eye out for that one. I'm actually really interested in that because Andrew is the type of person who seems like he will engage with. That is the one thing to his credit. Andrew Wilson seems like he'll engage with anybody, and I've seen him engage. I saw him set time aside in his day and have a debate with a guy who had a channel, and the guy's channel had like 20 subscribers, and Andrew was like, it doesn't matter, I'll debate you, which was interesting. My point here is that I'd be interested to see if, when I release a video on Andrew Wilson, if he would be interested in having a debate, because one thing I've never seen him debate really is the evidence for Christianity. And that's something that I think he would falter on that a little bit. If you've ever seen his discussion with Tim Pool, you could tell that he might verbalize a lot of things with regards to his theology, but you could tell he hasn't thought many things through. And as much as I'm annoyed by Tim Pool was cornering him on a lot of stuff. And it was interesting to watch him kind of waver a little bit. So anyways, my point is I would love to have a debate like that with Andrew, because I think I don't want to have a debate about like feminism or anything like that. I don't have hard opinions on some of those things. So to try to have a debate with him about Christianity or even laws of logic and the preconditions of intelligibility, I think that would be really interesting. Anyways, let's see. I don't see any more. Oh, do you have a, thanks, Kyle. Do you have a second carpentry channel? I don't. I've thought about it before. I think if I could go back in time. So for those of you that don't know, I do woodworking. That's not my full-time job, but it's like my part-time job. I don't have a channel. I wish years ago I would have made one, because I think I would probably have more subscribers and be making a little bit more if I had one. But I do have an Instagram, and so I haven't been on Instagram in a while, but I have a lot of the stuff that I've made there and videos that I've made. The only thing is I don't want to give away my Instagram because I would be worried about somebody doxing me. And I trust like you, Kyle, and people on, on here that I know, but I don't trust everybody. And so I would be, I would be worried that, because on my Instagram, I have, my wife's on there and I'm building stuff for people I know. And I just I wouldn't trust everybody online to know that. And it certainly has nothing to do. It's not like the skeptical agnostic woodworking. That would be weird. But anyways, no, I don't have a carpentry channel. What I might do every now and then is post some stuff that I've made on my YouTube channel. Like right now I'm making a desk for my daughter. It's almost done. And maybe when I'm done, I'll post it. Okay. So thanks for that, Kyle. Andrew Wilson is not authorized to debate the evidence for Christianity. Yeah, I mean, for those of you that watched the video that Alex Malpass and I did, we covered a clip of Andrew Wilson very quickly, and you could just tell, like, he takes a lot of Jay Dyer talking points because, of course, he's friends with Jay Dyer, and I think he thinks he knows what he's talking about, but he says some really weird stuff, and he doesn't know what he's talking about. And I think this is why you don't see him debating. Like, he does a lot of debates of Christian ethics versus secular ethics. But here's the thing about him. Here's why he's a really good debater. You got to give it to him. He's really good about just bulldozing forward. He's like Jay Dyer. He just bulldozes forward and he puts his opponent on their heels. So he makes them like defend their position. And rarely is rarely is the burden ever put on him. So, so it would be really interesting to put him on his heels and have him try to defend the evidence for Christianity, because I really think you could get him on that. What's interesting is Derek from Myth Vision had a discussion with Andrew Wilson years back. And in fact, it's a discussion where they brought Jay in. And see, I haven't watched the full discussion because it was on Jim Bob's channel, and Jim Bob has set that video to private, or he put it on a members only. So I can't watch the video. And I know that they were discussing the evidence for Christianity. And when it comes to like the biblical evidence and like the biblical evidence, Derek from Myth Vision knows his shit. So I really wonder if he was giving Andrew Wilson a run for his money. And then they brought Jay into the chat and Jay started running his whole stupid tag spiel. So I really wanted to watch that video, but it's private. And I wonder if they put it as private because Andrew didn't do good. I don't know. I haven't watched the video, but that's a video I would really like to watch, because that's a video where I would be interested to see Andrew's defense of Christianity, his defense regarding what Derek was bringing up. So, all right. Honest Doubter says, have you listened to Ask Yourself, Destroy, made by Jim Bob and his entire Discord on stance, independent, proper function? No, I don't even know who Ask Yourself is. I need to write some of this down because Sarah also brought something up. Sarah, can you again put in the chat what that video was about Andrew Wilson? I know I can go back through the chat, but Jesus Christ, this is almost 2 hours. I don't even know if I would find it. So it was Ask Yourself. I'm doing old school with the freaking pen and a paper because I don't have my other laptop here. I have this one in front of me, but I'm trying to read your comments. Okay, Ask Yourself. Okay, Ask Yourself versus Jim Bob. No, I'll have to check that out. I would really like to debate Jim Bob too, but I don't know. Sarah said he doesn't do it because he said he needs blessing from his church or something. That's why he doesn't debate that. Interesting. Well, he did do a debate. So he did do a debate called The Evidence for Christianity against some guy, but it just goes off the rails because the guy he's debating just holds some stupid positions. And again, Andrew's really good at putting the other person on their heels. So I don't even really think, I haven't made it all the way through the debate because that one's really hard to watch, but I want to see if Andrew even has to defend anything about Christianity, but I didn't know that. Interesting. If you get cornered by Tim Pool, you should question every decision you ever make. Oh man, Tim Pool, he's so freaking annoying. He's so annoying. So yeah, I think you're right. He just likes to hear himself talk. Alex, dang it, Alex, you're always missing my streams, man. Thanks, Alex. I think you'll enjoy it. But thanks for showing up. Thanks for showing up at all, man. It's hopefully soon we can do something together again. Maybe on your channel this time. But thanks, Alex. I appreciate it. Never too late. I get it. Would you trust me? I would trust you. I would trust you. I'll send it to you. I'll send it to you maybe on a Twitter message. And I would trust you though. But yeah, I definitely wouldn't put it. He's talking about my woodworking stuff. Yeah, I'll send it to you over on Twitter. Let's see. Oh yeah, thanks. Here it was. Andrew Wilson gets destroyed. Oh, 20-year-old. Objectivist. Philosopher. Prophet. Isn't this the most exciting thing you guys have ever seen? You get to log into a stream and watch me write stuff down. All right. Yeah, don't send to anyone. Okay. All right, guys. Well, thanks so much. I appreciate it. Thank you guys for being here. I was kind of a little bummed at first because only like 3 people showed up and then you guys populated it later. So I appreciate it. But even then, even if 3 people show up, I don't care. I'm still going to stream. So again, I'll probably do a stream later on in the week or next week about that Twitter exchange because I thought it was interesting. But thank you guys for being here. Look out for that Andrew Wilson video. It might not come out for another week or so because I still have to freaking write it. AJ said, like and subscribe. I appreciate it, AJ. Thank you. You've been a champion for my channel today. I appreciate it. Thanks, guys. So I'll catch you later. Thanks for showing up, and I hope you guys have a good one. See ya. Oh.